Hello and welcome to Out Loud. I'm your host, Greg Thompson, and today on the show we have Lina Landström. Lina is currently a Master of Theological Studies student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and Lina's gender pronouns are she, her, hers, identifying both as lesbian and queer. She's originally from Sweden, and although she was not raised in any particular church, we learn about her journey from worshiping in the Swedish Lutheran Church over to the United Methodist Church here in the U.S. Lina demonstrates a resilience in her reaction to the recent General Conference vote by the Methodist Church that affirmed the church's doctrine against full LGBTQIA+ inclusion. We discuss that as well as her hopes for marriage someday in the church and misconceptions about marriage for LGBTQIA+ people of faith. But before we dive in, I want to take a moment to say thank you to our Patreon supporters who are helping finance the production of this season. If you like what you hear, become a patron. At just $15 a month, you can get exclusive access to unedited episodes of the show, just like this one. And a quick thank you to everyone who came out to my talk in Missouri, as well as our first ever live show here in Nashville. It was so wonderful getting to know you all, and it was such a success that we really hope to do another live show again soon. And now, let's hear from Lina Landström. Thanks for being on the show, Lina.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you identify as queer and as lesbian. Can you break down those terms for me and what they mean to you, just to get us kind of started off?
Yeah, I identify differently depending on what day you ask.
Okay.
It's not super important to me with terminology and identity. I don't necessarily like being put into a box. I fall in love with girls. I'm a cis woman falling in love with girls mainly, but I've also, in later years, started like having crushes on guys. Like I'm open to wherever life takes me. So I'm not necessarily super strict in a box.
Yeah.
But I could write a book about about what it means for me and my identity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It changes, it sounds like, and varies.
yeah,
over time.
it's fluid. It seems like I'm more into girls than anything else. But if there's the right guy at some moment, then that's it. And so sometimes, like, gay or lesbian feels a little restricting, or I get too many questions when I have a crush on a guy if I say that I'm gay. But queer can also be a term that's hard for a lot of people. So in certain contexts, I say gay just because it's easier to understand.
Yeah.
So
When did you first kind of asking yourself questions about, oh, do I like girls and not guys? When did that start for you?
it came very suddenly for me when I was 12, when I fell in love with a girl. And it was like overnight, like literally, oh, okay. And that was a shock. And then after a few weeks, I sort of looked back at my life at that age and was like, oh, this makes kind of a lot of sense. So yeah, I was 12, and for the first few weeks, I'm like, I'm bisexual to myself, to my diary. I didn't come out until years later, but so yeah, I was like, I'm bisexual. I'm just gonna marry a guy that I fall in love with and ignore the girls. And after a few weeks, I was like, no, I don't, like, it's different with girls than with guys.
Yeah. And so you also said that you were raised not in any church necessarily, is that right?
Yeah.
So when did you start moving toward the church and start kind of facing a clash between those two identities?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in any kind of religious household. My family, through generations, is not at all religious or have a faith. So everyone is like questioning how did that happen, Lina?
Yeah.
But Sweden is, or especially was, when I was born in the 90s, and when I grew up, very impacted by Christianity. And we used to have a state church, the Swedish Lutheran Church. And so I was baptized as an infant in the church. So it was around me, but we were in no way going to church.
Okay.
And then I think I always kind of had a faith, although I didn't really articulate it as such. until much later. And then at age, I guess, 14, since I was baptized, or a member of the church, as was everyone else in my class, had the option to be confirmed. And after a lot of thinking back and forth, I decided to try it out. And at this point, I was already kind of scared of the church because I knew that I was gay. And so I was very hesitant to get into the church. But that is when it started, to sort of become more of a real thing. And I had during my teenage years, I had a lot of good experiences of church, and I also had a lot of clashes. I had a lot of fear about the Bible. I wouldn't touch the Bible because I knew it was homophobic. I had never read it, but people said it was. So there was a lot of I instinctively knew that the church and the Bible wasn't for me. So throughout my teenage years, it was in large parts that I am a Christian. I have a very strong faith, but I don't need the Bible or the church for my faith.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. A Christian faith without the Bible.
Yeah.
So what did the Lutheran Church in the U.S. now is fairly affirming. What was the situation like then in Sweden? Was it officially affirming of LGBT folks, or what was the culture like there?
I mean, it is fairly affirming. It started doing same-sex, not weddings, but ceremonies, partnerships on some kind of level in the 90s. Marriage came in 2009 when it also was legalized in Sweden as a state. So that came at the same time the church and the state, the same year with a few months apart. But it still differs depending on church and where in the country you are. But it is a fairly liberal or open and affirming denomination. But I remember it must have been the year before same-sex marriage was legalized. I had the conversation with one of my friends that had come out too, that was sort of my big thing at that moment, because one of the things that I've wanted since way before I knew that I was gay is to get married, and to get married in the church. Even before I knew I liked the church, I wanted to get married in the church, and that was sort of I was that little girl who dreamed of her wedding, and when I was 12 and realized I was gay, my partner changed to a woman, but that was kind of it. I still wanted that big wedding in a church. And so I remember having that conversation with one of my friends of that, I'm not going to be able to get married. What do I do? And I remember I'm not that old, but it was still a conversation that I had and a worry that I had growing up, that what now? I'm not going to be allowed to get married.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing for me when that changed.
Yeah. I think I had a similar kind of progression of realizations growing up too. I knew when I was in college, I was discerning the priesthood. Do I want to be ordained? And then I slowly came to the realization, oh no, I definitely want to be married. And was going to friends' weddings and watching the bride walk down the aisle and just tears streaming down my face with just the joy of oh, this is such a beautiful ceremony. This is such a beautiful symbol. And I knew how important marriage was to me before all of that, before coming out. And so I feel you in that sense of then you come out and it's now, okay, what is this, how much of that do I get to keep? And if some of that looks a little different, will it still be the same? And how much of that is what the culture is telling me I'm supposed to love, and how much of it is what I really desire to. So, yeah. Yeah,
so we're jumping in time now, but there's this Australian magazine of lesbian weddings that was launched maybe a year ago that I follow on Instagram, and that has completely blew my mind. I've never seen anything like it, and they post daily pictures of lesbian weddings around the world, and I just love seeing it and dreaming of it, and that dream is still so alive for me, and so it's so important to have those things. I mean, still today, we're way into the 21st century, and I am way up in my 20s. And I've been out for so long, but still seeing those same-sex couples, those girls getting married, still touches me so hard, like so deeply. I'm dreaming about my own, hopefully one day.
Yeah, absolutely. So what then brought you over to the U.S. from Sweden?
So I first came to the U.S. In 2009, and I did an exchange year at a high school in Kansas. I spent a semester in Kansas, in Hayesville. I turned 16 when I was there. And then when I was back in Sweden, I wasn't done. So at age 18, I came back for a college year. In 2012, 2013, moved back to Sweden, and it still wasn't done. So in 2015, I came back to the U.S., and I've been here ever since, going through college and now at the master's level.
What did your faith mean to you then? And was that was that shifting as you came over here?
Yeah, so I transferred. I did community college in California, and in 2016 I transferred to a college in New York to finish college. And when I lived in 2015, when I lived in LA, I had started going to church again, and I knew nothing at all about denominations, nothing. And so I just Googled LGBTQ friendly churches, and I happened to have a church within walking distance from my apartment, which does not happen in LA. So I started going to Hollywood United Methodist Church. And a church in Hollywood is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally a block from Hollywood Boulevard, all the stars. And it was a fairly large United Methodist Church, somewhat high church, but not super. It was far from that Kansas church. But it was me coming back to church, and it was me feeling very embraced by a church. This was a very queer-friendly church. So when I moved to New York, the pastor of Hollywood United Methodist Church recommended a church for me, Church of the Village, in the Village in New York City. And it's a small church, very far from high church. It's doing church in its own way, very lively, very eclectic, very multicultural, great music, very familiar. Like, it's a family environment. Yeah. So, yeah, that really became a home for me for my 2 years in New York.
And so, worshiping in the Methodist Church, did you start to associate with the Methodist Church, like, as part of the religion you identified with? And were you exploring that at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I never really explored anything else. Yeah. I kind of stuck with it after I had found it. I quickly learned that the Methodist theology very much was for me, and I could really identify with it. Denomination has never been super important for me, I guess, because of how I grew up. But I did become a member after about a year and a half of worshiping in the Methodist Church. I did become a member of the Methodist Church. And so it has become increasingly important because I have so much community in the Methodist Church now, in the American Methodist Church. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not the end all for me necessarily in terms of denomination, but
yeah. So we haven't talked about the General Conference yet.
No.
The elephant in the room within the United Methodist Church, and on regarding matters of LGBT inclusion. So what were your expectations as you've been coming into the Methodist Church, what have been your expectations about the church's policies on LGBT inclusion and leading up to the vote that happened in February?
It's so funny because I stayed away from church for so long out of fear for being excluded as a queer person. And getting back into church, it was so important for me that I found a queer inclusive church.
Yeah.
And of course I did find a church, but not a denomination. So it's kind of funny of where I ended up in the Methodist Church and in the midst of this struggle for LGBTQ inclusion. I had a queer pastor when I lived in New York for the first year and a half. And so I got very involved in that process after moving to New York, after the 2016 conference. So I was in LA still when the 2016 conference happened and the call for the 2019 conference happened.
Okay. So you were kind of involved in advocacy then, or just kind of knowing what's going on?
When I was in LA, I just kind of knew what was going on. Barely that, but I sort of heard of it.
Yeah.
They talked a lot about it. But when I came to New York, it became more of a process, and I went to Bishop Karen Olovito's trial in New Jersey with the church community, and I connected really, and that became very life-changing in so many ways, and so important for my faith in very ironic, positive ways to get into that fight for inclusion in the Methodist Church.
Yeah. So did you, in the weeks, days leading up to the conference, what were your expectations as far as how the church would vote on that?
I think I definitely lived in a bubble leading up to it, and I did not think that the traditional plan. I was very set for that. We're going to do one church plan. It's going to be this compromise, and I just thought it was obvious that that's how it was going to go.
Right.
That was what the bishops had suggested. That was what the commission on a way forward had suggested. So I just thought it's the greatest compromise. Of course that's going to happen. And I went into it the same way I went into the 2016 election, the same way I went into the Brexit vote. Like, of course everything's going to work out.
Great.
So, yeah, I was kind of surprised. I think I was not... I was not prepared for how it was going to go at all.
Yeah. And just to recap, for folks that aren't in the United Methodist Church or aren't plugged into this, because even when I was kind of following the headlines on the General Conference, I was shocked that it wasn't higher up on my feed from the New York Times about the vote and those kinds of things. So the Commission for a Way Forward was the group that was organized to kind of decide, okay, here are some different possibilities, some different routes as far as how we can organize as a church around LGBT inclusion. And you mentioned the traditional plan, which was saying keep everything kind of the way it is. Yeah,
so it does not allow same-sex marriage, and it does not allow LGBTQ clergy. And for a clergy that does perform same-sex marriages, they will be prosecuted. And it is the same way that it has been for the past few years. But they're sort of stepping up the trial process. So you will be sort of, as in a general court of law, prosecuted, but it's a church trial, and kicked out of the church basically on a much higher level. They're going to prosecute a lot more. So it's the same church laws and policies, but they're just going to enforce it a lot harder.
Yeah.
So you're still, and that it's important to mention that the church explicitly does allow LGBTQ congregants. So you're allowed to be a member of the church if you're queer. It has nothing against that, but it is clergy and same-sex weddings.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah. Which is important to at least be clear on, and because that's something we've talked about I've talked about with other people on the show before is this difference between being accepting and affirming.
Yeah.
And what I hear more and more from people, and I want to uplift, is like, if you're an affirming congregation, it means that you're willing to put LGBT folks in a leadership role and let them be in front of other people. And so this vote is a turn away from that, and it sounds more of just like an accepting, like, yes, you can be LGBTQIA plus and be in this church, and be in these pews, and that's it.
Yeah.
Can you receive communion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think what you just said is so important, because I remember the Hollywood church I went to, the children's minister, when I was there at least, was a gay man, married gay man with 2 young boys. And I remember that, with all the things you hear of like gay men being compared to pedophiles and that sort of homophobia of gay men and children don't go together is the sort of homophobic saying. That was one of the things that stood out to me about that church as so affirming, that not only do we put gay people and queer people in leadership, but we have them teach our children.
Yeah.
So that was very impactful for me coming to that church, and I think it's so important that it's not only the choir leader who's gay, but it's also the one in the pulpit and the one teaching the children, and like, where do you also put them in the leadership?
Yeah. Mixed in with everyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can understand your surprise, because it sounds like you had some amazing queer leaders, both in Hollywood and in the Village.
Yeah.
While you were kind of moving into this church. What was your gut reaction when you found out that the vote was going to be toward the traditional plan and not being affirming?
So we were in St. Louis. We were a group from Vanderbilt who went. And so the conference happened from Sunday through Tuesday, and we were there. It sort of was a pre-conference a few days before that. So we were there Saturday, Sunday. And just before we left on Sunday, there was an initial vote on what petitions they were going to work through in what order, and the traditional plan ended up as the highest plan. So, and you could see that all of the non-affirming stuff ended up at the top. And so as far
as what they wanted to vote on and discuss first?
Yes.
Okay.
And so that was what happened on Sunday, and then on Monday they talked through the plans in that order to sort of make any needed changes or whatever, and then on Tuesday the vote happened. And so they weren't going to get through all the plans or all the petitions. So that is why it was so important what ended up at the top on Sunday in the prioritizing list. And so I was sitting and I was holding hands with some of my classmates, and I remember we were in a stadium in St. Louis, and it just got dead silent. And I remember wow, I remember saying, wow, that's bad. So when the vote actually happened on Tuesday, there had been several votes before that, and the process was sort of this 3-day process where you saw where it was heading. So when the vote actually happened on Tuesday, it was just a confirming of what had been happening for those. So in a way, it was good because it gave you time to accept it in the process of it happening. So the biggest shock was there on Sunday when the initial vote was. And I think just I was really heartbroken, not so much for myself, but so much for, I have so many friends who are very, very invested in the movement, a lot more than I am, and who have been Methodist their whole lives and for generations, and have been called to ministry in this church, and who are amazing pastors. One of the best pastor that I know that exists in the world is a queer pastor at another church in New York City. And Pastor Lee, she is just the most pastoral person there is, and you want to kick her out because she's married to a woman. Like
Yeah.
I was so heartbroken, and I saw her. I just happened to be talking to her just minutes after that vote happened, because we were leaving, and so I was saying goodbye. And just seeing her, that was sort of the image that kept staying with me. Seeing her so heartbroken made me so heartbroken. Yeah.
What were folks saying around you in that moment, as far as, I mean, people being invested for their whole lives, like you said? What were the reactions of other people from Vanderbilt or just around you?
A lot of heartbreak, a lot of anger, but in general, silence.
Yeah.
We drove to and from St. Louis, and we had decided to stay to see the results of the vote, and after that we were driving home because we had a kind of a long drive home on a Sunday afternoon to come back to classes for Monday morning. And for the first half hour, 45 minutes in the car, it was just dead silent. 5 people, just dead silence. And in my communities from New York, and the people who are not geographically near me anymore, but who I know from the movement from when I lived in New York, there was a lot of heartbreak and anger. Yeah. Was in general the sentiment.
Yeah. And now that it's been about a month or so, what's and the shock has kind of set in and moved out a bit. What are folks saying around now?
It's very different, and it sort of goes in waves, and I hear a lot of different things from different people in different communities. Some people are very set on leaving and starting their own denomination. They're sick and tired of it. There's been a lot of grief, and even though the initial shock has sort of worn off, I've seen a lot of prolonged grief and questions that arises a little bit at the time. Like suddenly you remember, oh, what's going to happen to this, and now what about that? And so yeah, it's going to take a lot of time, but I see a lot of grief, and I see a lot of people who want to take their church out of the denomination, and I see a lot of individuals wanting to leave the denomination, but I've also seen individuals, myself included, feeling even more stronger committed to the cause of the United Methodist Church, and feeling now more than ever that we have to stay and be a part of the church.
Yeah. What brought you to that hopeful outlook? I'm so glad that's your response. But what is that? What has it taken for you to kind of come to that?
For me, that was immediate, and I think for me it was I do not feel called to ordination, and so and I've come so far in my process and where I am with God and where I am with the church. So for me, the immediate response was, even if everyone else leaves, I have to stay, because that young queer kid in the middle of Tennessee, in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of Texas has to know that they're not alone, that there is at least one other person somewhere in this church that does exist. So for me, I was like, I'm going to stay and hold on for those who grow up. Because also if the queer affirming part of the church leaves, then the more traditional side is going to become even more traditional. So what does that do for the young kids that grow up in that environment?
Yeah. That's a really helpful way of looking at it, I think. And not one that it's for me, like thinking about it, it's like this fight or flight response. It's like, okay, stay or go. Like, what do I do? And but it's also political, and it's easy to kind of get wrapped up in all that. But when you just said that about growing up in the church, it's also just a reality. Like, I mean, and there are statistics, about how many LGBT people there are just in general, and I'm not exactly sure like what percentage of folks throughout the world are. I think it's like 10 or 15% or something like that. But like that statistic is not going to change anytime soon. Therefore, people are still going to be raised in the Methodist Church who are LGBT identifying. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think you're spot on. Like, there's still going to be people in every denomination that are going to be faced with coming out in that denomination at some point.
And in every community, in every religion, in every country. And I think that is so much where my larger call in life is. So my response to the United Methodist Church was so in line of where I already saw myself going, although I didn't really see it happening in my own denomination. That is my part in this world. So
yeah, what my heart's like heavy about this.
Can I say something good about it though?
Yeah,
or like something that really made me happy was seeing the response from my Swedish friends to what was happening in the church. Because after I sometimes joke that it was easier to come out as gay in Sweden than it was to come out as a person of faith, which is somewhat true. And I think, if not on the podcast, we've talked personally about that sometimes the LGBTQ community can be very hostile towards people of faith and especially Christians in some ways. And I think that is true, that the secular LGBTQ community can be maybe just as hostile for against Christians as the Christians can be against LGBTQ people. So when this happened in the United Methodist Church, and after the vote, I sort of just posted something about it on social media with a link to the New York Times article about it. And my friends over in Sweden, who some of them I know are so anti-Christianity, and they could have used the moment to be like, hey, time to get out of there now, huh? Or like say something of Christianity isn't all of that good. But I got so much support from my friends in Sweden. I know some of them are so against Christianity, and they were like, I'm so sorry, Lina. I know this means a lot to you. I am so heartbroken for you. How can I support you? How can I help you in this? And I just think that is so beautiful when you can be there for one another for things that you don't believe in, but that the other person. It means so much for the other person.
Preach.
So that was really something that was so important for me in the wake of everything that happened, that I had those friends who are not at all connected to the United Methodist Church be so supportive for me. So yeah.
I love that. No, I'm so glad because, it's so. Just initially what I'm thinking of is the challenge of coming out to folks who don't affirm your sexuality at all. Especially, it could be family members or just people close to you, friends that you've had for a long time, and just what you said earlier is spot on, that like you can support people without having to totally ascribe to their belief system. And the same way you can support someone whether or not you quote unquote believe in their sexuality. That's I think that's a place that I've come to with folks in my life, is like you may not totally, this may not be the quote unquote lifestyle that you want for me, but I still want you to support me. And it would be wonderful if we believed the same thing, but just like in different faith traditions, I can only do but so much to evangelize you to believe what I believe about my faith, about God, or about my sexuality. Like it's a challenge. And so, but whenever someone reaches out, even if they don't totally are on, even if they're not totally on board with you, that's like a weight lifted too at the same time. Yeah.
And I think that is like what life is all about, and I think we need so much more of that, especially in this sort of, as we always talk about, this more polarized world, as we like to say, at a time of Trump and Brexit and all of that is happening in the world. I think it's so important that you don't have to agree with everyone. You don't have to understand their life at all, whatever it may be, but you can still be there and support them in their journey.
Yeah. Well, and what comes out of that, I mean, is relationship. And when you're in deep relationship with somebody, you know what matters to them.
Yeah.
And so they saw you post something about your church and they knew that mattered to you.
Yeah.
And they could reach back out. And the challenge with politics and just the polarization is that we lose that relationship piece so quickly, and we want to put a wall up or snooze or mute whoever we can on social media or in our day-to-day lives and just be like, I'm not going to hang out with that person. I'm not going to talk to that person. And you miss out on relationship and a deep knowing and that possibility to bridge a little better. So, yeah. That's great. I'm glad something positive came out of that for you. What is perhaps your prayer or your hope for the UMC?
I pray that the United Methodist Church can learn to love each other. The people of the United Methodist Church can learn how to love one another from both sides, from all sides, no matter what happens policy-wise, politically. I pray that the church doesn't split, although I think that's a lot to pray for. But I think a split would hurt everyone in different ways. So I pray really hard that the church is able to stay together and that we start talking to one another. And I think that's important, both in the church and outside of the church, that we just sit down and listen to one another and have a conversation and hear each other's perspectives and hear each other's sides. Yeah.
And whether in the church context or more broadly, what do you do to take care of you?
I tried to, and I started looking at this from a very faith-based perspective of that I'm in the same way I see everyone else as created in love by God. I too am, and it's sometimes easy to forget. It's easy to forget that you too is created in the same love you see everyone else being created in. And so for me, it's very important to care for the body and the soul and nurture it in the way that God intended it to be loved, that I love it in the same intensity that God loves me. And so in a way, it's very physical. It's like caring for me, eating healthy and balanced and working out. I have a dog, which is so important for my health in so many areas. He's the best little buddy, both getting me out on walks, but also just snuggling in bed and just loving me unconditionally when I get home after school, no matter how bad my day was. And going to church has become important for me now in recent years, more so than it was when I was a teenager. So I sort of nurture myself spiritually a lot by going to church. And I try to also experience different worship styles to sort of see where I find God, since I sort of dove right into the Methodist Church. I've been trying to go to some classmates to their churches and see what gives me joy and what gives me life and what kind of worship style do I enjoy, and where do I find God? And I think I find God everywhere. I don't need to be in church. I like going to church, but I don't need to be in church to be with God, especially in nature. There's so much God in nature. Yeah.
That's great. You mentioned you have a couple projects kind of coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, so I'm super excited about one specific project. I got a grant, so I'm going to Israel in May, which I am super excited about. It's such a I'm a history buff. Apart from it being like a holy place, I just love historical sites and historical places and history in general. So I'm going to Israel, and I'm there for the week of the Eurovision Song Contest, which anyone who's American listening to this will be confused as to what that is. And if you're European, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. But the Eurovision Song Contest is a contest that started as a peace project in the 50s, post World War II, as a way to bring Europe together. It was a part in the project of uniting Europe. And it's Europe-ish. It's sort of queering the idea of what Europe is as well, because it includes Israel and Azerbaijan and, in recent years, Australia. But everyone sends a song that represents their nation. So it's about 40 countries every year that competes, and the winning nation gets to host it the following year. So Israel won last year, so that's why it's in Israel this year. So it's a pop song contest. It's a peace project. It's this sort of unofficial pride festival because it draws a lot of, especially gay men, but a lot of queer people.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'm super excited to get to experience that.
And you're thinking, we talked a bit before, you're thinking about kind of taking some of this into your studies, studying Eurovision a bit, right?
Yeah, because it is this unofficial pride festival, or it's been called the Gay World Olympics by some, and I'm wondering, because it brings together people from Russia, where homosexuality is illegal in various ways, with Sweden, who, is very open, and all of these countries compete together, and you have openly gay acts, and you have same-sex couples on stage, and you have all of these, you have rainbow flags, and it's hundreds of millions of viewers all across the world watching this from so many different nations, particularly in Europe, but also across the world. And so I'm interested to see what does this, in countries, particularly in countries where having a regular Pride festival is hard or maybe even impossible, what does it mean to be able to go to another country for this festival once a year? And what does it mean to have this community? And what can we learn of this sort of intercultural exchange that is so queer affirming? And what can we take from that into other communities and other work? And yeah, I'm excited to learn more about what people think about it and what it means for queer folks.
Yeah. It reminds me a bit of my experience hearing you talk about that. Reminds me of going to the Q Christian conference earlier this year, which is a fully affirming queer Christian gathering, and I didn't realize what a big deal this gathering meant or was for people that were there, and how this is one of the only communities that this might be their only community that's where they can be totally out, totally themselves, both queer identifying and Christian of some flavor. And yeah, and the question is like, okay, well, now that you've experienced this and you're around people that are like you, or that have, love the same music as you do, or what is it that you bring back is always the tricky part, for sure.
something that I think that they do so great is that they allow people to have different faiths and different theologies, what it means to be queer and Christian. And I think that is sometimes forgotten in the conversation, and especially when you are in progressive Christian spaces where it's okay and it's affirming to be LGBTQ. And we spoke about marriage and how important marriage is to me, and I think it's important to remember that just because you're a queer and Christian doesn't mean that you sign up on a specific sort of progressive queer. People have a very specific idea of what it means to be queer, and they think that the Christian isn't as important for them. And I found that to be, even in queer Christian spaces, sometimes to be a struggle for me, that I wouldn't say that I'm conservative in any way, but that I hold parts of my Christian identity so strong, and I believe in marriage, and I believe in this and that, and that does not go out the window just because I'm queer. And I still want to get married in the church, and I still believe in marriage, and I still have all of these ideas of what it means in my life. That does not mean that everyone else have to believe in marriage or to be married or whatever. But
what doesn't, I think this is such an important point. Like, for you, what doesn't get thrown out?
I think relationship, and for me, that monogamy and what sex is, and marriage, and I think those parts are so important for me, those sort of quote-unquote family values that, progressives don't even want to mention that term because there's so many connotations to that, which is understandable. But I think it's important to remember that there is a queer way to live that life as well. And that, because even if I want to live that way, doesn't mean that I am in any way going to look down upon anyone who lives their life another way or is called to another way of living their life. But I think it's important to remember that as a queer Christian, I can still hold those values and find them important to my life.
And that's the hardest part, I think, is then deciding kind of, and part of the work of Divinity School too, is kind of deciding what you believe in. Like, what is your theology now on that? Because that's sort of uncharted territory, at least, especially for me in the Catholic Church. It was, okay, so church doctrine says that it's intrinsically disordered to practice homosexuality, is the phrasing. But if you throw that, so if I'm in a relationship with somebody and I'm essentially throwing that phrase out and just saying I'm not believing that part, does that mean I throw out the part of Catholic doctrine that's about being celibate until I'm married, and like you said, living in a monogamous relationship? I mean, like, it can be really, you're right, the culture can be really quick to just be like, maybe just throw those things out. But it becomes a question, in my tradition at least. Okay, well, what is the purpose of being celibate? Why is that important in this tradition? Is it specifically to save sex for procreation? Or is it something else? Is the act so sacred itself? Whether or not procreation's involved.
And that is something that is not talked about a lot
at
all.
No.
And even in Divinity School, people, and I get that it's a sensitive topic for a lot of people, and purity culture, like the trauma of purity culture, is very real. But it's also, there are so many assumptions made about you and your political values and your theology when you say that you're queer. And I can find that problematic as well. And also, like, going to date as a queer Christian who hold those values, how how does that even work? Like, I don't, that isn't a whole other navigation. And I think for me, it has become increasingly important, I think, that my future partner also has a faith, although that might not happen. Like, I don't know who I meet tomorrow. But how, yeah, it's hard enough to date as a lesbian, and then it's hard enough to date as a Christian lesbian, and then you sort of hold all of these thoughts and values around marriage and sex and this and that, and suddenly there's like
You've
no
walled
one
yourself
there.
off of society.
It's like, so I just wish that those are things that we could talk about more to open that conversation and not have it be so stigmatized in general, so that it also becomes easier to meet people who, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who sort of thinks that around my theology, even though I'm queer. And so, but if we don't talk about it, I'm never going to find my people, if that is how you want to put it.
What can you imagine as far as like providing more space for the complexities of our identities?
I think it's part of my very nature to just question everything.
Yeah.
I'm sort of, every time anyone want to generalize or anything, I'll always be the loud person, which, you know, in the classroom can be both a good and a bad. And I think that I too have struggled to open the conversation, and I wish that I could be a little bit more courageous in that part. Growing up in super liberal, progressive Sweden, it's not a conversation that you will, like, part of me moving to Nashville was that maybe it will be a little easier to sort of come to terms with what this means for me and find my people here and open that conversation. Because it also is something that I am trying to navigate in holding my identity and my values and my theology in this world, and not feel shame and not feel stigmatized. And then at the same time, like, it's a little scary to sort of open that door and say, sort of, this is me, and then you don't know if anyone's going to be there and be like, oh yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, coming out as gay or queer, that is a known fact, but then you become sort of marginalized in your own minority, and further and further, I'm already sort of a minority in the minority, being a person of faith, and then sort of, like, it becomes, you sort of cut yourself out of your community more and more.
Yeah.
So I think it's maybe just sort of boldly stating your truth and see who shows up for you. I don't know. I have a tattoo that says courage. I try to lead by that. I try to have a lot of faith in God, and that stuff works out. And there's several billion people on this earth. I can't be the only one.
Yeah.
Who thinks the way that I think and who I am the way I am. We are all very unique, but none of us are as unique as we think we are. So I don't know. I'm hoping it's a conversation we can maybe have a little bit more openly at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, you know, it goes both ways. I think it takes the people that we come out to not make those assumptions. Mm-hmm. But then I think, like you're saying too, you're right. I think, you know, it takes us kind of having that conversation with more people.
Mm-hmm. And being vulnerable, and it's hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard being yourself in a world that has very clear ideas of what you should be.
Yeah.
We all, no matter what quote-unquote side you're on, have to remember that in the end we're all humans. And that is sort of the thing that I try to preach, not from the pulpit, but sort of my message in the world is that we all cry the same. We are all mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and children to someone, and we are all scared of stuff, and we get our hearts broken, and it doesn't matter where in the world you live or what identities you hold. In the end, as humans, we are more alike than anything else. And sometimes we just have to be reminded of that, I think.
Yeah. It's a good reminder. Thank you for being on the show and for sharing so much of yourself with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. A special thanks to Lina for being on the show this week. If you want to follow her online, her handle is @Landström Lina. That's her last name before her first name. Just follow the link in the show notes. And if you'd like to share your own opinions about Eurovision, religion, and LGBTQ culture, feel free to drop her a line. I know she would really appreciate it for her research. We discussed a few things about the United Methodist Church that I personally have been learning more about lately as their vote unfolded in February of this year. More information about what happened at the General Conference, as well as other LGBTQIA+ voices in this conversation, can be found in our show notes. And if you have a resource you'd like for us to share for LGBTQIA+ individuals coming out in the United Methodist Church in light of the vote, please reach out and we'll add them to our website. Out Loud is recorded in Nashville, Tennessee, and is hosted and edited by me, Greg Thompson. You can learn more about the show at OutLoudStories.com and on Facebook and Instagram @OutLoudStories. And you can help support the show by contributing monthly to our Patreon page, which gets you exclusive access to unedited episodes of the show. Just last week, I dropped the unedited version of Maria Machansky's episode and completely forgot that we had a wonderful conversation about the Enneagram that we had to cut for time. So, join us on Patreon for little fun extras like that. Just visit patreon.com/OutLoudStories. On the show next time, we have a special live recording of the show from Vanderbilt, featuring guests from season 1. You really don't want to miss that one. Please share the show with someone as a way to start a conversation. Thanks for listening. Go in peace.